Good morning. This is a re-recording of our Editing for Tone, Sexism, and Stereotypes lecture on February 14th. During Tuesday's lecture, we talked about how to cover suicide, mental health, eating disorders, immigration, and the homeless community with sensitivity. We also talked about the existing racial bias and gender bias within U.S. news media today and how we're going to stop that from entering our work, right? So first and foremost, I want to talk about our mission. At the beginning of every single lecture, I talk about our mission, or maybe not the beginning, but at least once in every single lecture, I incorporate it. So I again want to say, first and foremost, we should only have three goals as journalists. It is not to become famous. It's certainly not to become rich, as we all know, but it is to inform our audience, to keep our community safe and protected, and to hold accountable those who force injustices on others. So this directly relates to what I'm talking about today, and I'm going to explain why. So I listed the reasons of why sensitivity is essential in ranked order. First and foremost, we want to be sensitive in our coverage for fairness and balance. When we became journalists, we also committed to a code of ethics, which at the bare minimum says we need to be fair in our work and we need to be balanced in our work. For me, this goes beyond the work that I create, but it also is included in our interviews, right? So not only am I going to present fair and balanced stories, I'm also going to be fair when I'm interviewing my sources and asking them questions, especially on sensitive topics like this. I'm going to be fair with the emotions that my sources have, right? We have to respect those emotions. And I'm going to be fair when they ask that I don't disclose something that's a really deep part of their life, right? A deep part of their story. So that's one thing. We want to be fair and balanced towards our sources. Second, while still important, not required, but we want to build trust within our audience in order for our audience to know that the information we are presenting them is accurate, is fair. They have to trust us. And the only way that they can trust us if we are inclusive of them and if they know that they are a safe space or that we are a safe space for them, rather. So the only way that we can do that is by showing them that we respect them. And that's being sensitive in our coverage. Third, we're likely to gain more support. So this is a bit more self-serving, although it's still serving others because we still have more stories to tell, right? And we want to tell impactful stories, but again, this seems more self-serving. So I do want to point that out. And I want to address that, it's possible that we also lose support this way, right? By people who say that we're becoming too woke, air quotes, or we're snowflakes, air quote, or whatever. For me, just being kind and being inclusive is not a partisan issue. Like it's just the bare minimum that we owe other people, but not everyone sees it that way. And I would much rather lose support by being inclusive of others, by being respectful toward others, than lose support by perpetuating harmful stereotypes, right? Not only that, for the most part, I'm going to say that most of these suggestions are really subtle. They're impactful, but they're subtle, and almost no one will recognize them when you do follow them. What people will recognize is when you include content that is harmful towards their communities. So I would highly encourage you actually just make these small changes because again, no one's really going to notice. They will notice though if you are hurting them. So I'm going to start with editing for tone. Editing for tone. So a journalistic tone informs readers of a subject without providing an opinion or malicious intent. Journalists don't always recognize when their own writing is ambiguous or opinionated. This is why it's an editor's job to ensure there's no unconscious bias. So I say editor, but I also mean that you should probably have a checklist at the end of every story to ensure that there's not any bias in there. So this is self-editing and someone else editing, peer editing, or, just editing, copy editing, whatever. Remember, our goal is to inform without leaving room for readers to perceive something about an individual's character based on our writing. We don't want to leave something out that could lead someone others to, or audience members to believe in stereotypes about one of our sources, right? So we do not leave room for stereotypes or any other harmful characteristics. Note, one magazine has a zero tolerance policy toward mind reading and seldomly allows words like dishonest, ignorant, or hypocritical when less abrasive words such as factually incorrect, uninformed, or inconsistent exist. This has nothing to do with individual communities, stereotyped communities, whatever. This is just being sensitive and having an appropriate tone with all of our sources. Okay, so I want to hop into this first. Editing for tone covering suicide. So news orgs generally do not cover suicide unless it's a prominent figure or unusual circumstance like a murder suicide, right? Or something that has to do with a crime and the perpetrator ended up dying by suicide. So while covering suicide, reporters should avoid phrases like committed suicide because this implies that they have committed a crime, which is not the case. This is someone's life. It is not a crime. We also don't use unsuccessful suicide attempt. For me, it's unsuccessful that, someone has felt so much weight, so much hurt that they felt the need to take their life, right? So we're just going to say suicide attempt. We don't provide details of the methods such as self-inflicted gun wound, overdose, whatever. We don't include contents of any notes or letters. I have covered a murder-suicide where there was a Google Doc that had a suicide letter and it was linked on Instagram. I read through it, but I didn't use it because I didn't want to pinpoint whatever content was in that letter as the source for this really complex decision. We don't want to glamorize suicide. That encourages others to follow suit because they think that they're going to get attention from it. So we're not going to glamorize suicide. We don't want to mistake correlation for causation. If you know that someone recently got a divorce and that they went and took their own life, we're not going to say that that's the reason. We're not going to say he felt guilty, they lost their friend, whatever. We don't know. Typically, suicide is not from one single issue. It is a very complex thing with several things leading up to it. So don't mistake correlation for causation. We don't want to offer simple solutions to such a complex issue, right? And lastly, we're not going to use our coverage over someone's suicide, not related to someone's suicide, but over someone's suicide to propel political issues. So for instance, if we know that a high, a prominent figure died by a self-inflicted gun wound, we're not going to use the announcement of their death to propel stories about gun control, right? That is highly insensitive. I think the only time it is appropriate is whenever the family's statement, calls for it, and then you can include it in maybe a paragraph about how many people die by gun wounds each year or self-inflicted gun wounds each year. But we're not going to use the announcement of their death to propel those issues. And that doesn't mean we don't use their story to focus on these issues, but it is not an appropriate time to do it when the coverage is specifically on them. Reporters, when covering suicide, should use phrases like died by suicide or took their own life. Provide a resource within the article that offers help to those experiencing their own suicidal thoughts. Report on who the person was and the life they lived. And if you do decide that you want to use someone's story to propel political coverage, you must absolutely ask for the family's permission first. I highly encourage every single time, if you know that this is a sensitive matter, then you need to, there's no question, ask the family. Editing for tone covering mental health. Okay, so the following is from the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. We do know that suicide and mental health are hand in hand. So this is what they encouraged us to ask ourselves before we include it in our stories. Is mental illness relevant to the story? If it is not meaningfully linked to the story, there's no need to mention it. What is your source for the mental illness diagnosis? Don't rely on hearsay. If someone's mental health condition is relevant, make sure your source knows with certainty the person's diagnosis. Third, what is the most accurate language to use? Avoid using derogatory words and be as specific as possible when describing someone living with a mental illness to help prevent stereotypes. So I'm going to go to this link here because this is another style guide on a fact sheet. And I found some really interesting things here. So like right here, We don't want to say crazy, psycho, nuts, lunatic, deranged, because this type of language only contributes to the negative attitudes about mental illness that keep people from seeking treatment. We want to avoid the assumption that a person committed a crime because of a mental illness. We don't want to label when referring to someone who is diagnosed with mental illness. Identify them as person first with a disorder. So we're not going to say she's an anorexic. We're going to say she was diagnosed with anorexia. Furthermore, I actually had an issue with this once, and I do use schizophrenic as an adjective, but I'm learning just with my students, along with my students rather. So I was happy to see how I could improve my work. We also don't say bipolar. We say that they were diagnosed with bipolar or live with bipolar. And here's something here too that's interesting. We're not going to make an assumption about how someone with the mental illness is handling his or her life. Use value neutral terms. So we're not going to say she battles anxiety. She suffers from anxiety. She's afflicted with society, right? We're not going to call a person a victim unless we ask what their preference is. If they prefer victim over survivor, yeah, absolutely use victim, but you need to ask. What is okay is to say she's being treated for an anxiety disorder or she is diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. So these are just a couple things to keep in mind. Most of the time, if you ask your source for their preference, that will keep you out of a lot of trouble, and it'll be meaningful. They'll remember that and they'll share it. Editing for tone, covering eating disorders. So news media does occasionally to frequently cover eating disorders, depending on the organization. Frank Bruni, a professor at Duke University and contributing writer for the New York Times, said there are two issues journalists can easily make when reporting on eating disorders. This is a quote he said, "They don't give an eating disorder the same consideration and gravity they do to other disorders. It can seem to them more a failure of character or discipline than the kind of profound challenge it really is. Where they see an eating disorder simply in terms of food. It's about much more than food." So when covering eating disorders, reporters should avoid using sensational photos to accompany the story. So if we're talking about a general broad story on eating disorders, it is highly, highly inappropriate to use a photo of someone on a feeding tube in the hospital, right, to accompany the story. Don't do that. Don't, show a file photo of some woman measuring her stomach, just things like that. We're going to avoid assuming eating disorders are only among women and then folks. We're going to avoid descriptors like overweight or obese. Again, we're going to avoid using warrior language such as battle or defeat, and we're going to include we are going to avoid including vivid details from their disorder. So, for instance, if they, share their morning routine with them or their meals with them, we're not going to print that because it's just harmful for our overall community. We don't want people to see that as encouraging, right? So we're going to avoid those details. When covering eating disorders, reporters should explore the nuances of recovery, recognize it's a nonlinear process and it's a continuous journey. Ask sources for their preferences between in recovery, fully recovered, partially recovered, and healed. Everyone has a different preference for where they're at. Again, you're going to use person first language. Instead of saying a person is anorexic or bulimic, say they have anorexia or bulimia. Oftentimes, people with eating disorders really don't see themselves beyond their disorder. So this is really, really essential in this scenario. It's probably appropriate to include content warnings in a reporter's note or an editor's note because this is a really sensitive topic that could impact someone else who reads it. Approach questions with sensitivity and understand the complexities of an eating disorder. Eating disorders, like I noted, typically do not receive the same grace that other disorders do. In the same way, depression and bipolar isn't a lifestyle choice, neither is an eating disorder, and we need to recognize that. So I'm going to go over here because this was released last week, right as I was planning on this. And this was from a freelance journalist who did battle, excuse me, I did not say battle, but who was diagnosed with an eating disorder. So she talks here about, again, how eating disorders do not get the same grace as other disorders do. And here's another quote from Frank Bruni that I did not include, but I think is also essential. And he said he thinks there's an understandable tendency to reduce stories about eating disorders to This person is scarily thin or dangerously fat to make it all about weight and appearance. That can have a voyeuristic freak show aspect to it, and worse, it disregards that what's going on, the biggest stuff, the messiest stuff, is often as much emotional and psychological as it is physical. So we're going to remember that. It's not just about food. This is an emotional and psychological issue. And then this is something I really liked, the advice. I really, really appreciated it. So Amelia Tate, who has fully recovered from anorexia, said it can help to give sources a sense of agency by approaching questions with sensitivity. She says she thinks it's always important to let people know that they don't have to tell you everything. They don't have to dive into their darkest memories, especially if they're triggering. To do this, she makes sure she starts difficult questions by saying something like, as much as you're comfortable with, can you tell me about this? She also avoids asking about weight or size, and she tries not to end interviews with difficult questions. Instead, she factors in wind down questions. This is really important for tricky topics like this. You don't want people leaving an interview just feeling absolutely upset, distraught, right? Because of the questions and the topic they were discussing. So she says she likes to ask people what they wish they could change about the issue they're talking about, what they'd like to see in the world. That way they're respecting their opinion and perspective and not just mining them for trauma. So I really appreciated that advice that was given there. Editing for tone, covering the unhoused population. So this was just a fact sheet that Street Sense Media provided. So first things first, we're going to be fair and accurate as always. Cliches and stereotypes often define stories about homeless people. This typically includes characterizations of a drug addict, a mentally ill person, a criminal, and an alcohol abuser. These are not unique to homeless people, and many people who live in stable housing also struggle with this. When reporting on homelessness, journalists should consider the role poverty plays in a person's life. Many people become homeless due to their inability to make a living wage and to afford a place to live. Speak to people with firsthand experience with homelessness. Don't ask someone who just merely knows a homeless person or works in a nonprofit for homeless people. We need people with firsthand experience if we're going to tell an impactful story. When describing homelessness, be specific. Critics also argue that using people first language draws attention away from the deeper issue of homelessness, such as people experiencing homelessness, right? It doesn't necessarily carry the same stigma as the term homeless person. I am now preferring unhoused population. They also have, some people say people with housing instability. So whatever your preference is. Be independent and transparent with your readers and your sources. Most of the homeless people that they interviewed are strongly in favor of compensation in exchange for an interview. So you need to note that when you're talking to your readers or when you're writing, your readers need to understand that you did exchange money or that you did it for an interview. Hold people in power accountable. So we're not only going to report on the homeless crisis, right? We're going to talk about why that exists and what the systemic issues that led to this crisis, are. We want to minimize harm, treat everyone with dignity and respect. Reporters should practice the golden rule by giving homeless people the same respect they would for a source who lives in stable housing. Seek informed consent and consider anonymity. And then consider the impact of your reporting. Okay, so editing for sexism and being gender inclusive. Like I said, some of these changes are really, really subtle, but they do make a bigger impact at the end of the day. So it's important to minimize gender bias in your writing and consider all the individuals within your audience. A few basic things to consider. Don't assume a particular job is filled by a particular gender. Not only are there many women who are doctors, there are also many men who are nurses and secretaries. Avoid gendered pronouns. A nurse needs to care about her patients, should say rather, nurses should care about their patients. If you think you have to use singular pronouns, just reword the sentence. For example, instead of saying each student must hand in his homework on Thursday, we're going to say each student must submit the assignment on Thursday. We're also going to use terms that can apply to both genders. So instead of mailmen, we're going to say mail carriers. Instead of stewardess, we're going to say flight attendant. Instead of councilman, we're going to say council member. And policeman, we're going to say police officer. So I do remember one of my editors, I did say councilwoman one time. And I don't think it was necessarily to single out the woman, like to make it derogatory, but I could understand how some people would perceive it that way. But of course, it was 100% safe to go ahead and say council member and include her with the others. Avoid man when you mean to include women as well. It's no longer proper to use man or men as a blanket term. Example, we're not going to say since the beginning of time, man has worried about death. We're going to say since the beginning of time, the human population has worried about death. Beyond the basics, we're going to avoid quippy phrases like boss babe or girl boss. They're just bosses. We're not going to say shiro, CEO, mompreneur. And we're not going to include irrelevant information about a business person's family if you wouldn't do it for all genders. Typically, when you're talking to a woman CEO, most of the time, or if you're reading about a woman CEO, rather, most of the time you're going to read about her kids too and how she balances work and family life. Most of the time, it's that same question is not posed to CEOs who are male. So we're not going to do that unless we do it for all. Avoid unconscious exclusion because you incidentally eliminated individuals of other genders. For example, instead of saying, whoever says she wants her team of women engineers to outperform the men, we're going to say, whoever says she wants her team of women engineers to perform best, or she wants her team of women engineers to land the #1 spot. In a story about the military, we're not going to say, he said he's so grateful for the brave women and men who sacrificed their lives. There are plenty of gender neutral people in the military. So we're going to say, he said he's so grateful for all who have sacrificed their lives. In a story about an event, we're not going to say she thanked all the women and men who put the event together. We're just going to say she thanked all event organizers to avoid unconscious exclusion with those who are non-binary, gender fluid, whatever. More beyond the basics, women deserve the same descriptors as men. So a man isn't stern while a woman is naggy. A man isn't a leader while a woman is bossy. A man isn't confident while a woman is a show-off or thinks she's all that. A man isn't disorganized while a woman is messy. And a man isn't communicative while a woman talks a lot. Yes, I do recognize I talk a lot, but I don't think it's fair that if a man who talks just as much as me is labeled communicative while I'm labeled talks a lot or chatty or whatever. We can either both be communicative or we can both talk a lot. It's not going to be, different based on our gender. When interviewing, please don't refer to male sources as Mr. and female sources by their first name. Typically, I use this below my signature in an email. If you prefer a different title, please let me know, just so you don't always know if a person is married, so that really throws off the Miss, Mrs., other Miss. So I do add that, I disclose that at the end. If you're interviewing a heterosexual couple, please confirm with the wife that she shares her husband's last name. So instead of bluntly asking, what's your last name? Because you'll definitely look silly doing that. Just try, hey, just to confirm, do you also use enter last name here, or do you prefer a different last name? On the subject of last names, if you recognize an individual includes 2 last names in their signature or in their title, ask how they'd prefer their name to appear in news. It has preferred pronouns if you're not sure. Editing for stereotypes. So Purdue Owl says biased language frequently occurs with gender, but can also offend groups of people based on sexual orientation, ethnicity, political interest, or race. Stereotype language assumes a stereotype about a group of people. So these are examples. I want to stress that I did not come up with my own stereotyped sentences. I copied and pasted them. So, for instance, this says, although she was blonde, Mary was still intelligent. Chris doesn't like tacos despite being Mexican. And we're going to avoid statements like ... for an Asian or ... for a Black man. Stereotype language also associates different groups of people with specific topics. So it's important to remember, stereotype language, even when a positive stereotype relating to intelligence or hygiene or finances or whatever is still a stereotype that we should still avoid using. Stereotyping doesn't only occur in written content, but also visual content. News media is more likely to publish images of Black individuals when referring to topics of crime and poverty, and is more likely to publish Mexican individuals on the topic of immigration. And this is where I also jump in to say the term Mexican is not harmful or offensive. It is what someone is. They were born in Mexico, they are of Mexican descent, and it is not harmful. If you believe that Mexican is a derogatory term, that is your own perception and your own negative connotations that you associate Mexican individuals with. It's no different than me saying that I am Texan, right? So just to point that out, it is completely okay to say Mexican in a story. Covering immigration. Okay, so I did not go with the blanket term of Latinos. I did take this from a guide, which I will share with you in a bit. So what you should probably ask each source what their preferences between Latino community, Latinos and Latine, excuse me, or Latinx. So first of all, report with the knowledge that the majority of Latinos in the US are not immigrants, and immigrants come to the US from every single country in the world, not just Mexico. Examine the ways immigration issues intersect with systems and institutions across society, such as child welfare and local law enforcement. Avoid racially charged, dehumanizing language, such as illegal when describing immigrants. Instead, use undocumented. Also, we are absolutely not going to say aliens. They're still humans. They are not aliens. They're humans. And we're going to talk about them and treat them as such. And we're going to cover immigration as a civil issue. Familiarize yourself with current policies and laws and accurately report on immigration reform legislation when you're talking about immigration. Okay, editing for stereotypes. So this is existing racial bias in news. According to Color of Change, news and opinion media overrepresent Black family poverty by 32 percentage points, while white family poverty is underrepresented by 49 percentage points. So essentially, Black families represent 59% of the poor in news, but they make up just 27% of the poor in actuality, while white families represent about 17% of the poor in news, but they actually make up 66% of the poor in reality. The same goes for the proportion of Black families receiving welfare. Okay, so the news media represents Black families as welfare recipients 60% of the time, but they make up just 42% of welfare recipients. News media is also 1.32 times more likely to associate Black individuals with criminality compared to white individuals. That is, 30% of those represented as criminal in news media are Black, though Black individuals only constitute about 26% of people arrested for criminal activity, while 28% of those represented as criminal are white individuals, though white individuals constitute for 77% of those arrested for criminal activity. So I'm just putting that out there. I don't know how that math doesn't add up. Regardless, it's very disproportionately inaccurate and biased. Solutions journalism. So I'm going to focus here. I'm going to take away for a moment on covering biases and talk about how we could better serve, even beyond covering the topics with sensitivity, but how we could better serve these topics through solutions journalism. So essentially, solutions journalism focuses on transforming journalism to ensure all have access to news that helps them envision and build a more equitable and sustainable world. This means replacing "if it bleeds, it leads" with more effective news coverage, curated specially for each individual community and topic. So I'm going to go here. Actually, I'm going to go back real quick to the race reporting guide that I went to. So I used Latino from Race Forward, but I want to share some stuff from the AP style book. So typically they accept the term minorities in news story, but I prefer communities of color and impoverished communities. I don't even like saying poor communities because there's just this negative association with it, right? So I would prefer to say impoverished. I say communities of color, Indigenous communities, and impoverished communities when I mean majority and minority communities. I don't like saying minority because they are not any smaller than us. They're still humans. So it feels like there's a power imbalance when you say minority. And we're only going to use race or ethnicity when it's pertinent, such as biographical and announcement stories involving historic events or groundbreaking events. For suspects sought by the police or missing person cases, when reporting a demonstration or a disturbance involves race or such issues as civil rights or slavery, covering specific racial groups, follow the person's preference, use a more specific identification when possible. This says don't clap, capitalize black or white, but I do, so I guess that's just your personal preference. Avoid slurs if necessary, use in quotes or better to identify as a racial slur or replace it with a generic descriptive in parentheses. Do not stereotype in negative or positive ways related to hygiene, intelligence, skills, or physical attributes. And use illegal only to refer to an action, not a person. Do not use the terms illegal alien and illegal, illegals, or undocumented. And remember that a lot of these individuals who have immigrated over here have they're refugees. So we need to remember that. So now I'm going to go over back to solutions journalism, and this says a new kind of crime reporting, right? So what I liked here is that they said they recognize that crime reporting remains a newsroom staple, but far too many stories still follow the clickbait model of if it bleeds, it leads. What's needed is reporting that provides information that would bolster public safety or examine the causes of violence and the lives directly impacted. Further, many mainstream reporters remain distanced from the communities they cover. In the absence of new journalistic practices and policies that challenge institutional norms, major outlets will continue to report on crime in dehumanizing ways that rob the public of knowing how to address issues like gun violence and better understand the communities most impacted by it. So they have a few suggestions right here. Questioning narratives about crime, controlling your own story, a call to action for newsrooms. And then, okay, so that was that. But I'm going to go over to solutions journalism and solutions reporting checklist. So to write a solutions journalism or story rather, we're going to look at a problem facing our community and ask who's doing it better, who's making significant improvement at a big or key piece of the problem, whether close to home or far away. You'll still be talking about the issue, but in a fresh way, about someone somewhere making progress in ways your community can learn from. Once you have possible answers, ask, how do we know? Is there data and other evidence that shows the effort is making a difference? Is that evidence credible, and is some of it independent from sources other than people leading the effort? If so, you got yourself a solution story. Hey, real quick, I'm almost done. Interview sources about how they pulled off their success, what challenges they've overcome, and which ones they still face. This is the how done it instead of who done it, the narrative engine of your story. Examine the limitations of the effort. This is journalism, not advocacy. So you need to interrogate the data and other evidence you have. Include all of the following in the story. What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? What does it tell? What doesn't it tell? Identify what can be learned from the effort, especially for your community and audiences. Include that in the story too. Finally, after the story is published or aired, listen to how people respond so you can answer questions, correct misconceptions, and pick up ideas for your next story, maybe your next solution story. So that's as far as solutions journalism. The last thing here, there are some further resources on topics I did not get to cover today. And this includes reporting on sexual assault, reporting on child abuse, reporting on autism. So I'm going to include that in the link, and that is all. I hope you all have a really, really great day.